The Biden-Harris administration has at last released its national security strategy, a document every president is required to release according to a law passed 40-odd years ago. These are supposed to tell the people what the plan is, how the Republic proposes to make its way in the world over the 4 years a new occupant of the White House will reside there. It took them long enough. It is nearly halfway through Biden's term, and his policy people have repeatedly delayed releasing these 48 pages. Now that they are published, I can't say as I blame them. I wouldn't want to put this muddle on paper, either. These documents are meant to tell Americans and the world where we are headed and to reassure us that steady hands are at the helm. We do not feel reassured. We feel frightened. The leadership of the United States, and this goes beyond the Biden regime's various ineptitudes, is simply unable to get clean of its addiction to global primacy and its obsessive pursuit of it even as the nation's power declines. The themes that define this national security strategy are two. 1. The document acknowledges the need to cooperate multilaterally to address questions that are transnational in character. Climate change is the premier example here. Others include global health challenges, international crime, and the kind of cross-border economic crises we see an awful lot of these days. Fine. These calls are apple pie easy. None presents a challenge to U.S. power, but good enough. It is the second theme that must concern us. Here we find ourselves in the familiar territory of great power antagonism, strategic competition, and America's obligation to lead the world in an almost biblical confrontation of democracy and autocracy. This is all the stuff Biden and his foreign policy people bang on about at every turn, never to any persuasive effect. The rules-based order, predictably, makes a prominent appearance. We will partner with any nation that shares our basic belief that the rules-based order must remain the foundation for global peace and prosperity. Scott Ritter believes that the U.S. policy has nothing to do with democracy and explains the rules-based order in contrast to the law-based one and the role of the military-industrial complex in the whole situation.
Well, it's definitely not about democracy, at least in the conventional sense. What the Biden administration is selling isn't democracy, it's American dominance. It's a system where the United States gets to, under the guise of setting a strong moral and ethical, standard that others should seek to adhere to, is instead imposing its will on the rest of the world. And anybody who is in opposition to this American-imposed hegemony is deemed to be autocratic, because, of course, if you're democratic, you'd love the American way. But the American way isn't democratic. There's nothing democratic about the United States anymore. Just being straight up honest. We go to polls and we vote, but we vote for one of two political parties that aren't democratic at all. There is no democracy when it comes to the Democratic and Republican Party structure. It's a system of political and economic elites that make their own rules and select their own candidates for inclusion in a ballot where the American people are presented with a predefined decision. We don't get to select who's president. The nominees for president are selected by others, not us. So it's not a democracy, and it's failing across the board to meet the needs of the people. It meets, of course, the needs of corporate America, thanks to Citizens United. Now corporate America is deemed to be a citizen online with actual citizens, and they have the money necessary to influence politics far beyond anything the average American could ever hope or aspire to. So we don't have a democracy in America. We have, at best, a plutocracy, and this is what we're trying to impose on the world. So, the national security strategy is about sustaining this system, this rules-based international order. Notice I didn't say law-based international order. I said rules-based international order, rules that have been foisted on the world ever since the end of the Second World War, where the United States emerged as the most powerful nation in the world, economically, militarily, and politically. So there you are. It has nothing to do with democracy, nothing to do with autocracy, everything to do with continuance of American global domination. The military-industrial complex plays a very important role in influencing defense policy and, by extension, foreign policy. They have allowed the perceived need to create the current military establishment to become a vehicle for dominating Congress, preventing Congress from deviating off course. It's the military-industrial establishment is the root of what people would call the deep state in the United States. It is a permanent, non-elected body that exerts extraordinarily influence on the elected body. In fact, in many instances, you can't be elected unless this non-elected body supports you. Hence, I go back to the Republican and Democratic parties not being democratic in nature. It's not what the people want. It's what the big companies want. Not just the military companies, but, pharmaceuticals, agriculture, other, anytime you have billions of dollars at stake, they're there. But the defense industry is directly linked to Congress because Congress has worked with these defense leaders to spread the wealth, so to speak. We're talking about budgets that are so big that they are literally game changers in local politics, given the fact that they imply jobs, with a good tax base, et cetera. The American dream, people who have these jobs can, of course, buy their house with the 2 garages and all this sort of thing, at least for the moment. So whenever someone says, well, wait a minute, we need to rein in defense spending, you can't, because the economy, the way it's constructed, depends on this money. If you cut defense spending, you're cutting jobs, you're cutting factories, you're cutting the tax base. So they're so closely intertwined, as to be one and the same. And so, yes, the defense industry plays a heavy role on continuing defense spending at the levels they are and increasing them. And normally you can't justify this kind of defense spending unless you have a posture on how you interact with the rest of the world that justifies this level of expenditure, which is why the National Security Strategy document is so critical, because that defines how America is going to interface with the world going forward. And given the fact that it's linked to this defense budget, it means our interfacing will be very aggressive with a high probability of military conflict.
So, a simulacrum of cooperation, but not even that when it challenges the traditional role America assigns to itself. This is the tragedy we are all fated to share, the shape of our grave new world. And I hope Biden is wrong when he says this will hold for generations to come. The national security strategies to themes are supposed to look like parallel lines, thoughtfully drawn to lead us into a sound future. They are not. They are perpendicular to one another and cannot possibly lead anywhere but to more of the disorder that now besits us. Jeffrey Sachs points out that Biden is dividing the world, which could lead to nothing good at all.
Look, the moment that Biden came in, he said our foreign policy, our greatest challenge of the age is democracies versus autocracies. The first moment I heard it, I said, wrong, this is bad. This is not the way to understand the world. The most important challenge of our time is our common fate on this planet, whether it is climate change or nuclear weapons or war and peace or a global pandemic. It is actually to work together to solve problems. But Biden started by dividing the world, which is just not the right way to get something solved. And I think he, following the neoconservative ideology in the United States, which is dominant in both political parties, he set up a confrontational foreign policy that in the end has weakened his own party tremendously and endangered the whole world, in my opinion, by putting us on a wrong direction. But if the Democrats lose in Congress in the elections, I would say that some part of that is a wrong foreign policy because it's created much of this, not all of it, but it amplified this stagflation, the economic contraction combined with the higher inflation, the hardships, the divide in the world, the tensions, the breaking up of global supply chains. This was all part of U.S. foreign policy of the last 2 years, and it doesn't do any favor to the U.S. This is not that the U.S. has gained something and the rest of the world has lost. No, the U.S. hasn't gained from this either. And it's not even that the Democrats have gained and the Republicans have lost. No, the Democrats have lost from this too. So I just consider it a mistake. That's my basic position, that this is a mistaken way to view the world. I wrote a book about this in 2019 called A New Foreign Policy, Beyond American Exceptionalism, which said we need a different approach. But what surprises me is that Biden has kept up this exceptionalist foreign policy. I thought he was much more pragmatic, much more domestic and economics oriented, but instead he really put foreign policy, and a wrong kind of foreign policy in my view, in the forefront, and that's weakened his domestic politics as well.
John Mearsheimer points out that promoting democracy is one of the leading causes of conflict in Ukraine and explains why the U.S. is interested in it.
My argument is that the West is principally responsible for this mess, not the Russians. This, of course, is not the conventional wisdom in the United States. And in fact, except for Steve Cohen, who's now at now at NYU, he used to be at Princeton, Henry Kissinger, and maybe a handful of other people, there are not many people who agree with me. But I think the facts are quite clear on this, that the West is responsible. And my aim is that the main deep causes, the aim of the United States and its European allies, to peel Ukraine away from Russia's orbit and incorporate it into the West. Our basic goal has been to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. And Russia says, this ain't happening, period, end of story. And we will do everything we can to make sure it does not happen. That's the deep cause. Now, take it a step further. There are three key elements in our strategy. The first is NATO expansion, and in many ways the most important. And I'll talk in some detail about that in a second. But as you all know, since the Cold War ended, starting with the Clinton administration, we have been moving NATO eastward toward Russia's border. And the Russians have said, this is an absolute no-no. And I'll walk you through the story in a minute. Second is EU expansion. EU expansion is all about integrating Ukraine economically into the West, the way we are in the process of integrating Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, the Baltic states into the West. And of course, we're doing that with NATO as well. These are two sets of institutions, NATO, military institution, the EU, an economic institution. And the idea, again, is to take Ukraine, peel it away from Russia, make it part of the West. The third part of the story is fostering an orange revolution. This is all about promoting democracy in Ukraine and in other places. As you all know, the United States runs around the world trying to topple regimes and put in their place democratically elected regimes. And for almost all of you, me included, it's hard to be against promoting democracy. We all love democracy. But if you're Vladimir Putin, or if you're part of the leadership in Beijing, when the United States talks about democracy promotion, that means toppling your regime. And you won't be surprised to hear this. They don't like that in Beijing, and they don't like that in Moscow. Right? They do not like that. Right? The Chinese believe that we're behind the protests in Hong Kong. You go to Beijing and you talk to Chinese elites, the idea that we're promoting democracy around the world, and especially in East Asia, just drives them crazy. because they think they're in the crosshairs. And you know what? They are in the crosshairs, because our basic strategy is to topple regimes all over the world, not simply because we like democracy, but because we believe that whoever gets elected will be pro-Western. So we're killing two birds with one stone. We're promoting democracy and getting leaders who are pro-American. But again, you can see the strategy here: NATO expansion, EU expansion, and promoting democracy.
Douglas Macgregor believes that the Ukraine war is a big mistake committed by NATO expansion and that the Russian change in Moscow is just lunacy.
We have a permanent interest in essentially preventing war from breaking out on the European continent. In fact, after 1991-92, NATO really existed in the minds of most of its members to prevent another war in Europe. So from that standpoint, I think we had an interest in that. Obviously, we've done the opposite. We seem to have done everything in our power to bring on conflict, which is tragic. And I had hoped that there would be an interest now in finding some sort of way to arrange a ceasefire and then hammer out details of a larger agreement. But I don't see any evidence for that at all. In fact, I see evidence for the opposite. If you look at the members of both parties, the so-called uniparty, everyone is screaming for blood. And it's not difficult to discern their real interest, which is in regime change in Moscow, which I think is lunacy, and it's also an unattainable objective. I think you've got to go back to the late 90s. Once the Clinton administration took over and was in full swing, we see people like Madeleine Albright, who are challenging General Powell, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, to use American military power to achieve goals. She was by no means a lone ranger. There's a whole coterie of people from that era. They're still with us now, who concluded that the victory in 1991 over the Iraqis demonstrated that there was really no one else left standing, and we could dominate pretty much anybody we wanted to with our military power. I'm not sure President Clinton was ever terribly interested. He certainly was not a student of European affairs, didn't understand Europe at all. I'm not sure he knew much about the Soviet Union or Russia, for that matter. So I don't think he paid a great deal of attention, and essentially turned foreign policy over to this collection of people that we now refer to as globalist elites, people who are interested in open borders, denationalizing Europe, denationalizing the United States. They're in control again. They really never gave up control completely after George W. Bush was elected. Effectively, the same people came in and continued the policies that had emerged in the late 1990s. So remember that when we became involved in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Bosnia-Herzegovina rapidly became about dislodging Milosevic and his government from power. Initially, they were seen as a legacy of communism, not without some judgment that was accurate, but they misjudged the larger picture. It had less to do with communism, more to do with nationalism. So they saw him as a leader they had to remove, and the Kosovo Air Campaign presented itself as yet another opportunity. And the opportunity unfolded in ways that people didn't understand. They grossly underestimated the Serbs, their staying power, but ultimately they managed to persuade Yeltsin in Moscow to abandon the Serbs. And that sent a whole range of new forces into action that offended the Russians, angered the Russians. The Russians began saying that, who's next on the menu? And, you know the stories about Iraq and Afghanistan. Everything was about toppling the government and then installing something new that was theoretically democratic for the purpose of advancing this so-called globalist agenda, which herded everyone into some global version of the European Union and increasingly a global version of NATO, all designed to extend the power and the influence of the United States and its ruling elites. Well, remember that over the last several years, I would go back certainly to the early part of this century, we began conducting exercises in the Baltic with U.S. naval and air power and even ground forces only 50 nautical miles from St. Petersburg. This has been going on for some time. We began conducting exercises right on the border of Poland and Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, in close proximity to Russia. So the Russians have been watching this for some time. That's one of the reasons they seized Crimea, was because they didn't want it to become a NATO naval base. And they were confident, based on our behavior, that that was inevitable if they didn't do something to stop it. I think they thought that that would warn us off. Now we have a government that has taken the position until quite recently that the Russians would never act. They would never dare to attack Ukraine, even though it was patently obvious to those of us that have been watching this business since about 2007, that was inevitable. For instance, the current CIA director, when he was ambassador in Moscow, wrote a memorandum talking about the Russians actually mean what they're saying. There is a red line, and we'd better not cross it. And his point was, at the time, Burns, that we were crossing it, that we were going to make some sort of military action in Ukraine inevitable by our behavior. Well, we've done that. We don't bother to talk about it because that doesn't fit the current narrative, that the unprovoked attack by the evil Putin is the source of all the problems in Europe and Ukraine. But, you know, there's a narrative that has been built that is widely embraced by the mainstream media, that's been carefully fabricated, designed to justify essentially whatever we want to do. But they were wrong. The Russians went in when they said they would not. They are wrong now if they believe that we can continue to push over the border into Ukraine, not just military equipment and military assistance, but also U.S. military personnel in any way, or NATO personnel in any way, without provoking an all-out war with Russia. So you're right. We are much closer to a direct confrontation with the Russian state and its military power than the people in Washington realize. That's their theory. They don't understand Russia is not Iraq.